Morning, Jeff.
Hey, good morning, John. How was your week going so far?
It's going pretty good. Just got a major project I'm working on. Before we get started, some housekeeping. That looks like the old intro.
Does it look like the old intro? You know what? You're right, and I need to go and change that. But I do have the new outro, so I can't wait to play that. But yeah, thanks. I had one of those weeks too, so I have to do some house cleaning as well. So at least we're on the same page, my friend. But hey, listen, we got a great show today. We're lucky to have Ken Adamo from DAT Solutions, and we also have Jason Miller, great guy, data centric, just like Ken. I'm not going to leave Ken out of this one, but we're glad to have both of them to join us today. So let's bring in Ken. I know that Jason is having a little bit of problems this morning, so I'm sure that he'll fix it and he'll be jumping on soon. So let's bring on Ken.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Hey, Ken. Good morning. How's your week going?
It's pretty good. Pretty good.
Yeah.
Pretty good.
I was reading this morning, and while John and I were in the back room, have you ever heard of a analytic company called CoreSight?
No.
Well, CoreSight predicts that there will be 15,000 stores across the country that will close in 2025. And when I look at that, Ken, I say, well, what about the final mile? The white glove, the deliveries, inside deliveries, that kind of stuff, that most of these stores rely on, these super regional distribution centers going. How is that going to affect the analytics of outbound and inbound, et cetera? You follow that kind of stuff, like on, new store openings, stores that are closing. I mean, it has a huge impact on supply chain logistics.
Yeah, when I first started at DAT over 5 years ago, we took a look at a data source that essentially tracks foot traffic.
Mm-hmm.
So one of my mentors at FedEx when I was working there went to work for Gojo right
Mm-hmm.
after we both left around the same time. And Gojo makes Purell. So, height of the pandemic, great time to go work for Gojo. Anyway, they were trying to get ahead of when they would need their deliveries into different facilities for their big commercial accounts. So they looked into this foot traffic data to see if they could model predictively when to get product out to those stores. But no, I mean, this is not nearly impossible, I think, to model.
Hey, morning, Jason.
Morning.
Glad to have you.
The foot. I think building off that, I don't worry too much about store closure numbers because that's only part of the picture, and that we'll also be seeing tremendous numbers of store openings. The amount of turnover that exists in terms of retail stores coming and going is something that, there's thousands of stores created each year, thousands of stores go out of business each year. So I tend not to look at these numbers and read too much into them at present.
Yeah, the e-commerce area is growing substantially over the last 10, 15, 20 years, as you well know. And I've said it a long time ago that malls, those kind of brick and mortar operations, are going to be something of the past. We're really leaning towards that. And you see it with the seasonality and Christmas time and all these different holidays and online buying. But with that, you have a tremendous amount of returns that a company is buying, right? What are your thoughts on that side of the business as far as the brick and mortar e-com and how that's going to affect the supply chain and logistics overall?
Certainly, online return rates, I believe, are about 3 times higher than what in-store purchase return rates are. But at the end of the day, right now, still about 75% of retail trade sales, once you strip out motor vehicle and parts dealers and gas stations, is still primarily brick and mortar in nature. I think we are starting to see more players get interested in that return space. I think one of the biggest reasons Amazon bought Whole Foods was just to have a more convenient approach for returns to try to keep costs down in comparison to always going to UPS. So I think the shift is, overall it's incremental. I tend to be a much more gradualist in terms of, thinking about how things have evolved. Because if you go back to, let's say, 1920, the way that we manufacture and distribute goods today really has not evolved that much. If you go back to the early 1900s, small mom and pop retailers were filing lawsuits against Sears Roebuck, claiming they were, anti-competitive to them. And Amazon's just the modern version of Sears Roebuck. So for me, I tend to view it as a much more sort of gradual shift. Certainly, e-commerce makes up a larger portion of the parcel business than it used to. You go back 20 years, most parcel was B2B. It's now majority B2C. So to me, that's probably the sector that has really felt the shift much more than, say, the trucking space. You've had the LTL carriers get into some last mile, delivery of the big bulky stuff. But in general, to me, it's been the parcel space that has been a little bit more affected. But now as we're starting to see more of the footprint for, e-commerce being buy online, fulfilled from store, that's even changing the parcel game a little bit. And, the regionalization of e-commerce activity by Amazon, I'm convinced is one of the reasons we've seen weak LTL numbers even since Yellow's closure when you look at the year-over-year comps.
What about you, John?
Yeah, we're seeing that in the space. It's interesting to think about it, just to be honest. The final mile is most of our deliveries, so we have to. I don't see that really going anywhere anytime soon for the industry that I'm in.
Yeah. Hey, Jason, I think we got an echo from your speaker or your microphone. Yep. There we go. That worked. That worked. So, So, Ken, what are your thoughts on that as well, from your perspective?
About the shifting retail landscape, I really don't think. I think we're too long into the e-commerce curve to see monumental changes at this point in the life cycle. Frankly, I just, when the Whole Foods Amazon acquisition happened, I was still at FedEx and maintained internally that was a square footage play, right? Where Whole Foods of any domestic brick and mortar retailer had the lowest stockroom square footage utilization. I'm sure that's not the only reason they bought them, but at the time, they just made a ton of sense from a forward stocking perspective. I think what you're seeing now is that I find quite interesting is you're starting to see the toothpaste go back in the tube for what regional parcel was the thing that happened during COVID, right? It was FedEx, UPS, and the post office when I was in the industry. And then you had On Track and a bunch of these other companies come up. And one of the largest ones just went completely out last week. Right? They raised tens of millions of dollars and now they're gone completely. So I just don't see a ton of change there. I don't see buying patterns change. I think we're fully ingrained in the culture of buying 4 different sizes on Amazon or Walmart.com and seamlessly returning the 3 that don't fit, or all 4 if we don't like the color. I certainly know that's what happens in my household. So this peak proves that out. Frankly, this peak has behaved largely like all of the other ones. We saw a little bit of an extension into January, I think mainly due to weather, but rates are collapsing back down as you would expect, are near to the day. About January 15th, depending on when that falls every single year, rates tend to go back down after peak. And guess what? That's exactly what they're doing. So,
we're in the we're in the return season right now. For the next several weeks, I mean, that's seasonality anyway, every single year around this time. I'm just curious about the numbers that we're going to see compared to last year's numbers on the returns. Especially when you look at women compared to men. Men kind of know what they want, they buy it, and we don't have to buy doubles or triples of it. But women, they buy triples and quadruples because they're a touchy feely. They want to try everything on, and whatever fits, great, and then return more than men. I'm curious about that on the return side, and how you would measure that. Because I mean, that's a huge expenditure for any kind of e-com business that is out there. I mean, they expect it, of course, but how does that affect everything else as far as the supply chain when you have more inbound than you ever had before, especially around this time of year?
I guess that just goes to my point. I don't know what Jason's thought is on this. I don't know that this year's gonna be dramatically different than any other year. I think this has just been behavior remember, you couldn't return anything in person during COVID, right? That was like, in my opinion, that was the big unlock that happened into the summer and winter of 2020, was that it wasn't that long ago that, like, one of the holdbacks to people buying things online, especially clothing and shoes and other items, was the returnability. And now that that's largely been solved through, like, taking your stuff, back to Walgreens for a FedEx return, or my wife takes the stuff back to Kohl's for an Amazon return. I think once that's been solved, I don't know that there's been what would have made 2024 peak any different than 2023 peak in that regard, but maybe. I just don't think it's enough to move the needle.
I think what you're seeing, and you're absolutely right. And I just recently done this, the return process has gotten so refined and so seamless and so easy that, yeah, I agree with you, Jeff, that you're going to see a peak right after Christmas, because you always do see a peak at Christmas. But I think you're also going to see elevated numbers throughout the remainder of the year as well. There will be some differentiation right after the holiday, but as easy as it was to return, I mean, it was nothing. I mean, I printed off the label and slapped it on the box and took it to the UPS store and dropped it off. I mean, you just don't get any easier than that. No. And, you usually, I remember, back in the original, when returns were really starting to get started, and this is not even e-commerce, this is returns back to to the stores. You got hassled. I mean, whoever was behind that counter was judging you, and basically you were on trial for returning that item, and they could decide whether or not they were going to, honor that. And now you don't have that at all. You don't have the hassle of having to deal with a human being. You just drop it off and you go, and nobody says boo. So I think that convenience right there is what's going to drive that return rate up even higher year over year as we move along, as more people see that, because they're going to start doing, a lot more shopping on e-com. I know people who are hesitant to buy clothes on e-com because the color on the screen isn't the color that you get, as Ken mentioned a minute ago. And so that's, the fact that you can return those with ease, why go to a brick and mortar retail store?
Mm-hmm. So what are your thoughts, Jason?
Yeah, I'm with Ken on this. I think any change right now, it's very incremental and gradual. The increase in returns will increase with the linear functions of what unit sales increased, with maybe a slight addition if we have more e-commerce, and that has a slightly higher return rate. I don't see, I mean, for me, when I look at, kind of seasonal patterns, the retail season is now spread out much more than it used to be. It's now a lot more into October and November, whereas it previously used to be primarily December. The other big change now is because of gift cards, sales do not drop off in January like they historically would have. And so you would usually see a 20 to 25% drop in not seasonally adjusted retail trade sales as you moved into January from December. That drops now 15 to 18%. And so that's shifted things just ever so slightly, since gift cards are being used after the holidays. But again, there's nothing to me right now that's sort of special. We have seen a little bit of inventory pull forward as well, due to, I think, the joint port strike and tariff concerns. But that it's looking nothing like the inventory accumulation that we saw in 2022. So, I think just as Ken described, we're kind of in normal seasonal patterns. Spot rates have been higher, I think, primarily due to weather. And that's why as we move into February, it'll be interesting to see if the weather stabilizes a little bit, if we start to see those rates go down, as I expect they will.
Yeah, I have one of the biggest controversial question here, and I'm going to ask you guys. It's a tough one. Is the freight recession over? We've heard it. We've heard it from freight waves. We've heard it across the board. Everybody is pushing that narrative. What are your thoughts, Jason? I'll start with you.
So what I would say is it does appear that volumes are off of the seasonally adjusted trough that we experienced in maybe Q2 and Q3 this year, especially Q3, which, as everybody recalls, softened after a lot of folks got preemptively too excited in June. We're not yet seeing the type of sustained uptick, though, in volumes yet that would indicate that, we're really seeing a rise. Once we get ISM's PMI, especially the new order data for January here, in about 10 days or so, that'll give a little bit better of a sense. And to me, I think too, it comes down to how do you define a freight recession? To me, it's all about volume, and it is a sustained, basically economy-wide, wide-reaching decrease in freight volumes that has a material effect on market participants. It's not about pricing. Price is an outcome of how demand changes relative to supply. So to me, I would say it feels like we're off the bottom, but we're not yet seeing the type of sustained increases I would want to see to really say, okay, that freight volumes are truly substantially, meaningfully increasing at the moment.
So if you can read the future, when do you think we're going to see a spike? And is there anything out there vertical wise that would be the trigger point that would change everything?
To me, the only sector that really has much potential this year to shift things is construction activity, especially residential construction. Because that'll drive a lot of manufacturing demand for wood products and shingles and bricks and large appliances and things of that sort. But really, I think to see a sustained increase in that side, we not only need more new single-family starts, but we also have to have the existing home sales market essentially unthaw itself. And right now, with mortgage rates above 7% and houses still over 50% more expensive than they were before COVID, that is a tough ask at the moment, because even though the Fed's cut interest rates 100 basis points, we haven't seen mortgage rates go down because that's tied to the 10-year T-bill, and the 10-year T-bill yield is based more on inflation expectations for market participants.
Yeah, that's as a shipper, one of the things I look at, and you hit the nail right on the head, is I look at flatbed supply and demand because that's usually indicative of housing starts to some degree. And if you start to see that demand tick up, that's a barometer that the rest of the country is coming up, and it's going to start turning around. So that's one of the bellwethers I look for almost on a every other week basis, just to kind of see, sooner or later, if the flatbeds go up, demand goes up on flatbeds and it stays up, then reefers and dry vans are going to follow. And then that's what's going to drive your pricing, to Jason's earlier point.
How about you, Ken? What are your thoughts about the recession and what you see on your side? And when do you think, what quarter is it going to switch?
Well, luckily, the folks that have been screaming the loudest about this are now focused on a train museum, so we're not going to hear too much about, I think, the ending or the starting of the freight recession. So that's good. I mean, look, the term recession it means receding, right? Like, I don't think we're receding anymore. So I think the freight recession, first of all, I think it's an absolutely terrible term. I don't subscribe to it. I don't think you should describe markets as recessionary that are highly cyclical. When the gas prices are down at your local service station, you don't come home and tell your wife or husband that we're in an oil recession. So I just don't subscribe to the notion that calling it a freight recession does anything but generate website clicks or these kind of podcast discussions. So we're in a highly cyclical market. Was the last cycle peakier on both the ups and downs than ones past? Yeah. I'd say like normally the freight market is very tidal, right? Ebbs and flows. I'm not expecting a tsunami. The last two were like tsunamis when the market came rushing back. We had COVID, and then before that we had ELDs and the first Trump tax cuts and everything that kind of ushered in this glut of consumption and spending. So I'm expecting this one to be like 13 to 17. If you go back and look at that period in freight, that's a pretty well studied cycle. We're probably a little slower than that cycle picked up. That's to be expected from a just like where it started perspective in the calendar year. So yeah, I think February is going to be slow, but I do expect things to come back seasonally and cyclically March, April, May of this year. We can't weather, like the market will hammer itself back into correction. Like, again, I just gave a rant about being sensationalist, but if we spend 25 like we did 23 and 24, there will be like catastrophic impact to carriers, which will jolt the industry back. So I don't think that will happen. There's no way the carrier, like, don't think about an individual, like think about capital C, like the carrier population at large, they cannot weather another year like the last two. So for all of those reasons, I think we'll get back to like a slow burn up to 10 to 15% year on year positive by the end of the year. That's generally where I think things are going to land.
So are you taking in effect the new tariffs that the Trump administration is going to implement on that? And how is that going to affect what we're talking about right now?
I don't, this is not a political statement. I'm neither for,
No.
I don't make political statements. There's just this high likelihood that Hulk Hogan's running the IRS in 30 days. Like, I don't know, how do you predict what's actually going to happen, right? Like the new head of the DOT, I don't know if you watched his confirmation hearing, but his family had a logging company and he helped get a bridge built in Wisconsin. That's like his overall qualification to run the Department of Transportation. That's like me saying, like, I ride in a car and occasionally on airplanes, so I'm qualified. Like the deputy chief of the DOT is a lawyer from the Heritage Foundation. It was just nominated last week. So like, I don't think tariffs are actually going to get implemented. But like, have you ever seen The Office? Anyone here ever seen The Office?
Yeah.
You know, when Michael Scott walks out of his office and says, I declare bankruptcy, and then Oscar tells him it doesn't work like that. You can't just say bankruptcy. He says, I didn't say it. I declared it. I don't know if you watched Trump yesterday, but he said, I demand, I demand interest rates to go down. It's like, it doesn't work that way. The Federal Reserve is a separate operating body from the government for a reason. And you can't just demand them to go down. And again, even if you did, it would have massive second, third, fourth order derivative problems that will ripple throughout the economy. So I'm not baking tariffs into anything because they're essentially in like a fun house at this point of political spectrum.
So should you look at, I always look at the what if scenarios just to be prepared, right? If something happens, look at it proactively, all that. So what can we do proactively if they do get implemented and those tariffs are put in place?
The best advice I ever got, I'm curious I'll give you the best advice I ever got, and it works in golf, it works in business. It's like, if you plan for the things that are plannable, and then you'll respond to what happens. So like, what happens if you're playing golf with a slice? The first thing that happens, you're going to aim way left over a farm field, hoping the ball curves back into play. That's the straightest shot you'll hit the entire round when you go do that, right? Like, I think what you should do is, look, there's always going to be foreign policy things that impact supply chains, things that could happen. The Ukraine war is something we couldn't have planned for when that happened, and it dramatically impacted supply chain. So I think giving yourself optionality in the supply chain is advice that transcends all political parties and all geopolitical environments. So, give yourselves optionality. Maybe give yourself a little slack in your just-in-time procurement processes. But my advice would be, I would not go out of your way to like rampantly nearshore things or change your practices or buy up. Inventory is incredibly expensive to hold right now with interest rates where they are. So I don't know that I would be making any of those broad changes based on, like, again, pure political conjecture. That's just my, and maybe that's just my kind of naive distrust in government in general. I don't know.
Gotcha. How about you, Jason? What are your thoughts on that?
So what I would say is, right now you have to plan for different scenarios. I think we'll know really quick once February 1st comes, because that's been the date that has been continually thrown out there. I mean, my statement is especially the Canada-Mexico tariffs will be a very bad thing for freight volumes. They will be inflationary. It really hits the auto sector disproportionately. You're not, it takes, as we all know, months to retool an auto plant. So it's not like all of a sudden Ford's going to say, well, you know what, let's make Mavericks here in the United States because we just have a plant sitting empty that we can just retool and move all that equipment from Mexico. And so on that side, I think Canada, Mexico is certainly inflationary for the consumer. Tying into what Ken said, the Fed has one option if inflation starts to creep back up, and that is to take interest rates back up, and we all know what that'll do to capital investment. On the China front, I do believe something's going to happen, but as I've written on LinkedIn, there's a very clear trade-off here. If you want to tariff everything from China, you have to be willing to force Americans to pay, for a 10% tariff, 4 to 5% more for consumer electronics. You have to be willing to essentially say to the American people, this is what you're going to pay. It's not going to change freight volume. We're not going to assemble cell phones in the United States or microwave ovens. And so, tariffs, we've had, Ken, I'm going to use your terminology. We had a tale of a tape in 2018, 2019. We really ramped up tariffs in October of 2018, and 2019 was a bad year for the freight market. So we've already seen sort of a tale of the tape that if tariffs were this magical solution to increasing, domestic manufacturing and freight volumes, then why was 2019 a bad year? In 2020, until we had COVID that upended everything, nobody was really getting that excited about 2020, I don't think. And so, I think that tariffs would be one of the few things that would, I think, hold back what should be a fairly good year for carriers. Again, this isn't going to be 2017. Certainly by the back half of 25 doesn't look like the back half of 2017. But I think the goal is to make sure that we do see a steady increase in freight volumes. We should have that just due to the tailwinds of the interest rate cuts. Extensive tariffs, especially with our two largest trading partners, North and South, are the one thing that could derail that, though.
John, what are your thoughts?
I concur with Jason and Ken as well. I keep a cautiously optimistic point of view and keep my options open. And you'll hear me say it 100,000 times. You control the controllable, you deal with the rest. And it ties right into Ken's statement about planning the plannable. You make sure all that is buttoned down and locked in place, and then you just weather the storm and see what comes of it. I'm in the same camp with you guys on the tariffs. I mean, tariffs is going to impact, pricing, and pricing is going to impact consumer confidence, and consumer confidence is going to impact supply chain. If people stop buying, or slow down the buying, or their discretionary income is being eaten up somewhere else, then all these retail and e-commerce, and even on my side, the food service industry, it's going to slow it down, and it's not going to be good. So with interest rates being what they are, I think if you pile on tariffs, that's just going to make a bad situation worse.
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind, and everybody remembers what happened, like I believe that you shouldn't put all your eggs in one basket. And I referenced Fukushima and the diode issue way back in the day when I was working for a very large electronic company. And here we were scrambling all over the place. That kind of put everything that I used to do into perspective, where I really started looking at proactively at the what if scenarios. What happens if something happens, and how am I going to respond to that issue to still keep the supply chain moving, right? So you can't put everything into one basket and hope for the best and saying, well, it will never, ever happen. The point is what do you do when it does happen, and what is the probability of it happening? You know, you hear all the talk that's out there and what's going on and what they want to do. So as logisticians and, you know, supply chain people and whatever, we have to prepare for that. I mean, I hear what you guys are saying. I understand exactly what you're saying. But, you know, when you report to somebody and they expect you to react to a situation, you better have answers. You better have answers. You better be able to network, and you better be able to find out other alternatives and options and solutions to a problem that most likely will exist if those things happen. Your thoughts?
Yeah, diversification is the key to survival.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. So let's move into another thing. And Ken brought it up before with the carrier that went out of business. You know, that's all I've been reading every single day, that somebody is going into bankruptcy. You know, closing up, not small little guys. I mean, some sizable ones. So will carrier bankruptcies continue this year? What are we looking at? What are you hearing out there? So forth and so on. Ken?
I mean, it's the easiest question because, yeah, I mean, the industry turns over to 100%. The carriers were going out of business during COVID, which was the best freight market in 100 years. So, yeah, there's going to be a lot of carriers that go out of business because on a good year, for every 100 carriers that go out of business, 105 open up. And in a bad year, for every 100 that go out of business, 95 open up. So that's basically, if you look at like any of the publicly available data or any of the model data, it looks like a Christmas tree, right? Because you have red bars on the bottom and green bars on the top, and the best you can hope for is that one outweighs the other. So yeah, I think what happens at this point in the market every single time this happens is consolidation, right? RXO bought Coyote, last couple cycles, right? Celadon sold, FedEx Freight's going on the block, UPS in a prior cycle sold their LTL. So you see like a lot of consolidation. I think trucking company bankruptcies are a very poor barometer of the overall health of the trucking industry. I think it makes for really great storytelling. I think it's important to look at, but at the end of the day, if we had like a canonical crystal ball view of like power units that are out there turning their wheels, that would be a great thing to study. We don't. And none of these things are great proxies for that. Look, we look at it too. I'm not saying you shouldn't look at it and it's a bad metric, but I just think like, yeah, I mean, bakeries are going out of business too, right? And then new bakeries are opening up, and all of these things are happening. And I'm just, you know, I oftentimes wonder why we don't cover when Bob's Trucking goes out of business when the market's hot as much as we cover when Bill's trucking business goes out when the market's cold.
Yeah, I think to support Ken's statements on that. So the Census Bureau actually tracks the creation and destruction of every business in the United States that has at least one employee. So this doesn't capture your for-hire owner-operator who is a non-employer firm that's an LLC. So that piece is missed. But between March of 2021 and March of 2022, the carriers that were founded between March of 2020 and March of 21, so carriers that would have been 1 year old in that period, in the greatest freight market of all time, destroyed 34% of the jobs that they had when they started. So in other words, you saw rampant failure of businesses that were young, even during the best market cycle that we've ever had. And so per Ken's point, this is exactly what happens. Even during the global financial crisis, by far the worst time period for the trucking industry in the last 40 years in the United States, you still had a bunch of new entry that took place. You just had a lot more failure and exit that occurs. And so I read very, very, very little into, the announcements of bankruptcies, except if it's like a 400 or 500 power unit carrier, then that may pique my attention a little bit because that's a little bit the abnormal.
Hmm.
But in a given year, 10,000, at least 10,000 employer for hire trucking firms are going to fail. And so if we were keeping track of it, it would be like if we keep track of every single fatal accident that happened on the highways, nobody would want to drive if that took place. And so, just as we described, bad market, 100 fail, 93 get created. Great market, 100 fail, 110 get created. It's just the nature of the beast.
Yeah, and you talked about fatalities, and safety is first and foremost for myself, and I know John as well. But when you look at 21.6% of the number of active carriers on the road, say it's 5 million that are OOS or unroadworthy, that's 1 million out of 5 million. So it's a 1 in 5 chance when you're running down the road, that's when you pass one of these semis, they could be unroadworthy, they're unsafe. And at any given moment, they could blow a tire or whatever and kill a family of 4. I talk about this all the time. These carriers out there that are running in this economy at a very thin rate per mile are one breakdown away from bankruptcy. They really are. I mean, they're getting squeezed like there's no tomorrow, and they're putting safety not at the front but into the back, and they're pushing and they're pushing and they're pushing and risking. You're talking about brand, image, reputation, not just as yourself, as a carrier, as a broker, as a service provider, as a shipper. Everything in that truck that's moving on the road is linked to you. And people just fail to recognize that or put a lot of emphasis on that. I don't know if you had any data on that kind of stuff, but it's very alarming. I understand it to a certain degree, but why not just shut your truck down and just call it a day? I mean, and besides putting, people at risk like you and I and our families.
There's an identity crisis in the industry, which is the problem. The problem is that number hasn't budged when the market's been hot, cold, or anywhere in between. And I subscribe to Matthew Leffler, the armchair attorney, Michigan State.
Mm-hmm.
Shout out. I subscribe to his idea that we should just raise the minimum insurance requirements. They haven't been risen in like 40 years. But that's the problem. That's what I mean by identity crisis. You say that. So if you ask a room full of owner operators and small carriers, 100 of them, they raise their hand and take it down when they start disagreeing. Everyone agrees the industry needs to focus more on safety. Everyone agrees there's too many trucks out there and less competition would result in better rates. If you ask them if they'd be willing to raise their insurance premiums, which would put 20%, whatever the number is, 20% of them out of the door because they couldn't afford it, which means they couldn't, get insurance and be safe at the higher levels, every hand would come down. So I think this is what I mean. There's a gap in the things that will fix the industry are not the things that we necessarily want entered into our industry. Because I think we all agree, 20% of motor vehicles you have 80,000 pounds of steel that are unsafe at any speed, 20% of them.
Right.
Like the hot topic du jour is broker rate transparency. It's broker rate transparency is not going to make those vehicles safe. If you get ran over by a semi truck and you're lucky enough to survive, you're not going to say, boy, I wish that carrier knew what that broker was making on that load. You're like, no, I wish they had to fix their brakes. Right? Because what is the number one out of service inspection problem is brakes, right? Brakes, wheels, and tires. So I don't have an answer here. I just think this industry is bizarre in that it focuses on the wrong thing at times. Do you think the airline industry has this crisis of conscience about what's important? No. We haven't had, other than that poor woman that was sucked out of the window on a Southwest Airlines flight, there hasn't been an airport fatality since I was in elementary school in North America. Or no, middle school, I guess, being 9/11 kind of era.
Mm-hmm.
And the only other one I can think of is when that poor person was ran over when that airline skidded off the runway in San Francisco, and there was the foam to protect the fire, and the poor fire truck ran over the person. It wasn't even an in-air accident. So the airlines are very focused on safety. They have to be. You wouldn't fly if 20% of all airliners were unsafe at any speed, would you?
No, not really. But when you think about it, when there's a law and regulation that mandates, and it's part of your CDL license, the number one test is in order to attain your CDL is pre-check inspections. Yet most of them don't do it. I mean, to your point, Ken, airlines. When I was waiting for a flight, I saw the plane, parked, and the pilot got out and started walking around. Checking the wheels, looking at the wings, the flaps. Just checking what he could. He's not a mechanic, of course, but he's just looking for abnormalities, something that's sticking out that doesn't look right. And of course, when I saw him doing that, my flight got delayed because there was some problem that he identified and they pulled it out and we had to wait 3 hours. But we don't see that at the shipper, where I would like to mandate that kind of stuff, as another step in providing safety, even when trailers are brought in dropping hooks at these large establishments and you have these yard horses that are switching trailers in and out, there's responsibility on both ends. The carrier, the yard horse mover who's moving these trailers in and out, as well as the shipper to identify a problem, bald tire or whatever, and not just load it because they're under pressure to move freight to get it on the road to make some money. There's a failure there. There really is a failure. And I bet you any one of you guys that asked anybody out there, hey, show me the DVR report from this morning when you pulled in, the driver vehicle inspection report. Do you think you'd get it? Even though it's a mandatory requirement that requires all drivers, all trucking companies must check their vehicles before each shipment is moved. Your thoughts? Anyone?
A couple things that come out. So first off is, especially for firms that have a decent number of inspections. So if you're a broker or a shipper working with, mid to large carriers, here's some real easy rules of thumb. This is based on me looking at thousands of CSA scores. They got an HOS compliance basic score above 1, don't use them. They got an unsafe driving basic score above 3, don't use them. Simple, easy. They got a bunch of inspections contributing to that. Those are 2 cutoffs I can show you with data for the last decade. You should not be using those firms. So straight off the bat, you can eliminate, some of the bad actors from your network that way. The challenge is how do we measure safety for the much smaller firms, the new entrants, and whatnot, because they may not have that many inspections. One solution, and this would not be popular, but that means you need a lot more resources going to the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance to perform a heck of a lot more inspections than we currently perform. So if you increase inspections by 25, 30%, you start having more firms that have valid CSA scores. You can start empowering brokers and shippers to make those better decisions. So I think that's one big aspect. The challenge is, of course, anything that's more regulatory hurts the smaller players, hurts the younger players. And so it really comes down to, I think, as a shipper, how you place and prioritize value. Obviously Amazon's had a lot of very negative publicity about the fact that within their Relay app, they have not been necessarily the most stringent, as Chris Weaver at the Wall Street Journal reported. And so that's essentially a side effect and a consequence of that. But so a lot of it starts with the shipper and broker community to use the tools that the FMCSA gives us to automatically start to, basically say to these firms, either shape up or you're done. And I tell you, if I would pull up a CSA profile and if somebody had a score of like 1.5 on hours of service, regardless of whether you think hours of service matters or not, that tells me that carrier has no good set of formal management control practices, that they're getting hit that often. And so as a shipper or broker, you say, okay, we're just not doing business with you. But again, that may now start meaning you're paying a couple cents more per mile per load, and that starts adding up really quickly. And so that's the other challenge is with shippers and brokers viewing the transportation or the traffic function as a cost center, there's that incentive to cut costs any way possible. And what does that mean? That means letting more folks into your network and potentially folks that you may not want in that network.
Yeah, but what is that? What is that cost relative to, a nuclear verdict or thermonuclear verdict? I mean, here you're trying to balance. Yeah, I want to save the money. I don't want to go and do that. But when you look at 21.6%, right, or 1 million out of 5 million trucks out there, you have a 1 in 5 chance of something really bad happening out there, where you have your brand, your image, and your reputation inside that truck. And do you want that on your shoulders if you happen to kill a family of 4? I surely don't want that, and as an ex-shipper, I always made sure that whomever I did business with, that they did a pre-check. I even had my supervisor, my dock supervisor, go out there with the driver and do a walk around. I mean, of course, you're not going to tear down the engine and look at all those things, but just the things that you can see and you can touch: airline brakes, canisters hanging, wires, bald tires, lights out, you name it, even ICC bar that's bent, I mean, or a hole in the trailer. There's so many different things that can be checked, and it only takes 10 to maybe 20 minutes of your time to do such a pre-check. I mean, listen, you talk about HOS rules, right? So you can drive 11 out of 14 hours of the day, right? So you've got 3 hours of downtime, whether you're on the dock, you're doing paperwork or whatever. Why not take a little bit of that time in that 3-hour time frame, walk around your truck, and do what's required? I mean, skimping and trying to cut corners doesn't save anybody, because, I mean, it just shows irresponsibility. It tells me that that driver doesn't care about his family. He doesn't care about his fellow American, the broker or the shipper, and vice versa. Even if you look at the broker and the shipper, they're all responsible, and it's irresponsible what they're doing, and why they don't do it, I can't figure it out. But every customer that I do business with, I tell them that's on one of my checklists. You want to do business with me? Well, safety is first for me. I'm not just trying to protect my business. I'm trying to protect yours. I'm trying to protect the carriers and my fellow Americans that are out there on the road that are driving next to these animals. They're 80,000-pound missiles. I mean, you're not going to stop them from plowing into anything if they lose their brakes or blow out a steer tire or whatever.
And I think, Jeff, from a shipping standpoint, the good guys are not exactly in the majority out there. And to Jason's point and your point, when you start trying to pinch that margin, corners get cut. We all know that. So I guess my question here, the thing I'm trying to wrap my head around, you wanted to mandate pre-trips, which I think is an awesome idea. I think it's good. How do you enforce that? How do you make that happen?
It's easy. I mean, on what point? I mean, if you want to do business with someone and you say, you know what, here's the requirement, in order to do business with me and my shipper, to have that DVR sent immediately, like before you pack that truck.
Yeah,
right.
But
if shipper and me,
but not every shipper out here in the country is like you and I. Everybody's out, a lot of people are out here playing the short game, and you and I know we need to play the long game, and that's making sure making sure safety's there, making sure, sustainable rates, everything that plays into that. But we're all everything I've ever seen, we're in the minority. I don't see the every shipper stepping up and say, yeah, we'll mandate pre-trips. I just don't see it. And it would have to be some type of illegal enforcement. And I don't know how we could get our hands around that and be effective.
Yeah, but it's interesting though, right? That's the number one test when you take your CDL license. I mean, it's the number one mandated test that you have to pass. And it tells you that you need to do a pre-check inspection, right? Before every shipment is moved.
I get that.
So you're breaking the law. So if you're not doing that and you can't provide that DVIR to an inspection agent for that morning, right? I mean, let's look at crash forensics for an example. Okay, driver fills out the DVIR in the morning. He takes off 300 miles out. He blows a steer tire. because of bad belts, kills a family of 4, right? So what the forensic investigator is going to do, and I have a friend that does it, they're going to reenact the accident. What happened between A and B before the accident happened, right? They look at the tires. They see that, oh, you inspected it and you said there was 3/8 tread on it. I believe that's the mandatory least amount of tread that you can have on it. But your belts are showing and it blew out. You didn't do a DVIR. You know what I'm saying? By cutting corners. Well, he just screwed the carrier. The carrier didn't force it. The shipper didn't do it either. It just tells you there's so many different aspects to this problem where everybody is supposed to do their job in order to keep the public safety and keep their brand image and reputation intact, but refuse to do it. So what happens? You get a $420 million, thermonuclear verdict against you, and you're screwed because you didn't want to take 20 minutes out of your day and you killed somebody. Now you got to live with that the rest of your life. It's total irresponsibility. So the question needs to be asked, why is it on a CDL license and a requirement if you're not going to do it and they give you the CDL license,
I agree with you completely. Believe me, I'm right there with you. But I mean, if you're one of these fly by night guys, you're going to do just the bare minimum to get along, get through, push through the system. And then if you get pinched on anything, I would say pre-trip's going to be the first thing goes out the window.
That's a shame. I did a poll not so long ago and I asked them, what is your number one priority as a shipper, as a service provider? Not one put safety first. Not one.
That doesn't surprise me.
It wasn't even in the top 5.
They're not thinking about it, or they're not worried about it. Well, guys, I got to jump. Jason, Ken, nice meeting you.
Yeah, I got to go too. I appreciate you guys coming on. I mean, we talked a lot. We'd love to have you come back in a few months and talk about, the economy and what's changed at that moment. Will it happen in quarter 2, quarter 3? Will it happen at all this year? It would be interesting to find that out. Thank you guys for coming on. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Bye.
We'll see you. Thanks.